Let me take you back to Rome. And no, not ancient Rome. We're only going back a couple hundred years. 1781, and Rome is still predominantly influenced by families with maple ties. One of these families is the Massimos. They're centuries old and they own a number of properties around Rome, one of which is the Villa Palombara. It sits atop the Esquiline, one of the 7 major hills of the city. In this year, a tattered statue was discovered by residents of the villa, amongst the ruins of those who had once called the hill home. After it was reattached, it resembled something of a discus thrower, and the statue fit in well with the growing collection of ancient sculptures rediscovered in modern times, but a discovery just a couple years later would make this find a little more interesting. Hadrian's Villa, 17 miles from the Palombara and one of the most iconic Roman architectural wonders from antiquity, and here another sculpture was uncovered, and upon their own reconstruction, another discus thrower emerged. Both were clearly examples of ancient Roman sculpture, but what those of the time hadn't realized is how these 2 sculptures would help redefine our understanding of the birth of Western sculpture. So, what are they? Well, for one, Roman sculpture surviving from antiquity is far more frequent than you might think, and that would seemingly make these less enticing. But in the case of these sculptures, it became apparent that there were multiple copies. So which of these was the one of many, the original? An answer seemed lost to time. What about the other question? Who made them? Who was the sculptor? An answer lies in the words of Lucian of Samosata, an ancient Syrian satirist. An excerpt from his work Philosudes. The sculpture, bent over in throwing position, this head turned back to the hand that holds the discus, and the opposite knee slightly flexed, like one who will spring up again after the throw. That's one of Myron's works, Discobolus, we speak of. And there it is, 2 names, Myron's Discobolus. So now we know the sculpture, but who is Myron? To answer, we've got to go back even farther. Ancient Greece, 450 BC, an era defined by the birth of politics, philosophy, well, art. And not just pottery, I'm talking sculpture. Take the Greek bronzes, the prototypes for the Roman marbles. Even 2,500 years later, the level of detail is incredible. But they didn't always look like this. Sculptures like these didn't just appear overnight, they evolved. Early on, they looked much more like this. And I really do mean all. They're called kouros, and their features actually make them pretty easy to spot. Beaded hair, stiff smile, broad square shoulders, a detailed torso, and a staggered stance with 1 foot forward. They're the not-so-distant cousins of ancient Egyptian sculpture, which they not so subtly borrowed from. But I have to say, once you've seen a couple, it starts to feel like you've seen them all. So, how did it shift? When did ancient sculpture shift from this rigid, stylized, and symmetrical form to the fluid, naturalistic, and expressive work I highlighted before? The answer, much like the Discobolus, was found in ruins, this time atop the Acropolis, one of the most iconic ruins from Athens, and it was here that scattered remains of a sculpture were discovered next to, unsurprisingly, a kouros. Once reassembled, art historians realized that a potential link between the 2 eras could have been discovered. They called him Kritios Boy, but what was new? What made him different? After all, he looks similar to the kouros, but he's actually the first example of a style called the contrapposto. I like to think of it as where stillness meets motion. You can see it in the work. It's where the weight shifts, the hip dips, and the knees bend. It's through this axis-breaking movement that we see how art becomes life. And it's in this revolutionary style that we see artists break out of this plane that was so dominant in the kouros. And it makes sense. Humans are 3-dimensional beings, so it's not far-fetched to show us in dynamic settings. And each artist from this era had a different interpretation on the life that they were bringing into their work through this technique. But I believe that this era's greatest interpreter of that life was none other than Myron. Myron of Eleutherae moved to Athens in the mid-5th century BC, much like some of the other great artists of the time, such as Phidias and Polykleitos. But while many flocked to adorn Athens with the most awe-inspiring sculpture they could imagine, Myron was busy working on cows. That's right, Myron was arguably better known in his era as a sculptor of non-human life. For instance, cows, dogs, and others were intermixed with this human-centered sculpture. There's actually a poignant quote from the time. In this cow, nature and mistress art did compete, and Myron awarded the prize to both. And it's in this quote we see Myron's attention to detail. You might remember me mention it when it came to the Greek bronzes, but I'd argue that it was actually one of Myron's best qualities, a quality that helped him sculpt his masterpiece, the Discobolus. The same Discobolus that would go on to inspire the two discovered over 2,000 years later. In the sculpture, you can see the aspects that made it revolutionary. Not only does it use this idea of the contrapposto, it seeks to further the idea of exaggerated realism. Myron decided to create his character at the peak of his tension, his body confined into a bow shape ready to explode out. You can see the tension in his muscles, his torso in an exaggerated twist, the veins straining and popping. It almost feels too real, like Myron overshot the idea of realism and went straight to perfection. It doesn't help that his character's face remains a blank slate. To him, this moment of maximum potential is casual. He's essentially godlike, a mortal god. Gone were the days of the stiff and formulaic Kuros. A new breath of interpretation was here in sculpture, and that's why the Romans copied it. Deeply inspired by the high standard of Greek art, one that emphasized heroism, dynamism, and in Myron's eyes, a sense of idealism, they were drawn to the work of the masters of Greek sculpture. But as the Roman Empire began to dim, the copies fell into obscurity, buried amongst the continual shifts of their world. But this is just their backstory. London, 1940. It's been a little over a year since England joined the war, and not long since the beginning of the London Blitz, a massive area bombing campaign that will last 8 months, leaving 40,000 civilians dead and over 2 million homes and buildings damaged. Among those is the British Museum, home to one of the largest collections of historical artifacts. And prior to the war, it was home to one of the 2 original Discobolus replicas discovered 150 years prior. But as Europe teetered on the edge of collapse, it was likely tucked away in the vast network of the London Underground or hidden away in the countryside. The other of the 2 statues had an equally as interesting story during this time. Originally stored in Rome following its discovery and a brief stay in Paris as a war spoil during Napoleon's reign, the sculpture found its home in Munich in 1938. Positioning itself at the center of the conflict. One man had set out to get the statue on German hands, Adolf Hitler. But why? Okay, last time we'll take you back. This time to 1936, Berlin. Thousands of people are piling into the German capital to watch the Summer Olympics. 5 years prior, the Olympic Committee had offered the country the opportunity to host as a sort of acknowledgement and a chance for Germany to re-enter the world stage following World War I. And Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party would do just that, but not in the way that everyone had expected. You see, Hitler viewed the Berlin Olympics as a chance to win over some of the dissidents who called for its boycott. For instance, he allowed a small number of Jewish athletes to participate, but in the same breath he pushed his ideology of Aryan superiority. Throughout the games, he likened the German people to the ancient Greeks, painting them as stoic, chiseled, and heroic. And one way he emphasized this was through art. It's well known that Hitler, a failed painter himself, used art as a reflection of his beliefs. His war on so-called degenerate art, any work that rejected tradition, embraced modernism, or challenged his vision of German culture, coincided with his push for a revival of classical forms. For Hitler, German art was meant to be celebrated through the Aryan body and mind. In my opinion, this peaked in 1938. When the party released Olympia, a propaganda film from the Olympic Games. It's the opening sequence in particular that is striking to me. Set in the ruins of the Acropolis, arguably the most iconic image of classical Greece, the camera showcases numerous examples of Greek sculpture. As the movement slows, it settles on the image of a discus thrower, the very same discus thrower that Hitler would purchase within the year, and the same discus thrower sculpted by Myron 2,500 years earlier. After the pause, like magic, the work becomes human. All of a sudden, the sculptures of ancient Greece spring forth into living beings, the people that Hitler viewed as defining his Olympics. His people were no different than the humans that birthed democracy, philosophy, and modern artistry. It's a classic example of the Nazis' propaganda machine, and an effective one at that, as shortly after its release, World War II had begun. Hitler's Discobolus managed to survive the war, eventually returning to Rome, while its twin in London also remained intact. Both statues carried with them the heavy symbolism of the era. Once seized and repurposed as propaganda, they now stood as reminders of endurance, as they always will be. So when London finally had the chance to host the games after World War II, their Olympic poster placed their own Discobolus front and center. It was a reclamation of a symbol that the Nazis had tried to corrupt, and it played hand in hand with the nature of regrowth that permeated the 1948 games. The choice stuck. The sculpture would go on to become a staple of the games, and you can actually still feel its influence in modern interpretations. It's a story of a sculpture which doesn't just span centuries, but millennia. A work literally born from the concept of movement in art itself to that of political pawn over 2,000 years later. The Discobolus is certainly not confined to the time box of other works, and I think it's safe to say that, based on its track record, its story is still in the making.